Hello, my name is Wayne Costi. I'll be giving this talk, Military Keynesianism, the Peril that Eisenhower warned us against. The conference goals that we have here are to demand that the government spend more money on people's needs and not the war machine, to reduce spending on the military, reduce the ability to wage discretionary wars, and eliminate money for building a nuclear arsenal, which can't be used, it's illegal, and if it does get used, that's the end of civilization as we know it. And we also want there to be an increase in spending on human needs, healthcare, education, and infrastructure. John Maynard Keynes observed that the traditional conservative ways of cutting costs and instituting austerity programs was an ineffective way to recover from a recession or a depression. He did much of his work during the Great Depression and afterwards in order to understand what actually had happened. He noted that austerity programs generally resulted in layoffs. Layoffs because the people that lost their jobs would then not be able to spend money. They would then cause other people to lose their jobs because there was less money in circulation. He argued that governments should encourage spending, increase hiring, and even use deficit financing to spur the economy during economic downturns. He also noted that government outlays need not be wasteful. He said government investment in public schools or public goods will encourage private sector growth. So he encouraged spending on basic research, public health, education, and infrastructure. These could all be targeted to promote long-term prosperity of the nation. The importance of understanding Keynesianism is that we need to develop a strategy, and a strategy developed locally can build the foundation for a national strategy. If we misunderstand or underappreciate the opposing forces, this will lead to an ineffective set of solutions, and potentially will make program recommendations that could not be followed. So it's important to understand this Keynesianism issue. So you have to understand these forces to develop a successful strategy. So what are the forces involved? There are forces that exist for spending on the military. We have defense contractors. We have many labor unions who are clamoring for jobs wherever they come from. The public applauds military spending because of the media. They're told to. Media is shaped by unelected and influential persons who have a penchant for military spending, and we'll kind of give you some of hints as to how this happens later on. There are even foreign and allied governments that encourage our use of our military to protect their interests as they see it, or because they are co-imperialists with the United States in many ways. We also can't forget the financiers. There are people who make a lot of money raising the money that it takes in order to build all these armament industries. The forces opposed to spending on the military would be simply an aware public. And so that's what we're here for, trying to educate some of you as to what the issues are and why military spending is not very productive. We've heard some of those other issues earlier today, that spending of the military creates fewer jobs than creating other spending in peaceful sectors, in which the multiplier effect is increased largely because it's money that is spent here and doesn't go into building things that nobody can use outside the military. So military Keynesianism. Military Keynesianism is the position that government should raise military spending to boost economic growth. The term is often used pejoratively to refer to a politician who apparently rejects Keynesian economics for domestic and civil purposes. However, they argue for using Keynesian-based arguments in support of significant military spending and also in support of deficit spending. Barney Frank who was in the House of Representatives for a long time, he's no longer there now, said this shortly after the 2008 financial housing crisis meltdown and the ensuing economic recession. He says, reducing excessive military spending would allow us to provide the short-term economic stimulus needed to continue the progress we are making in breaking out of the recession. Ironically, many of my conservative colleagues have opposed the idea of reducing our military budget on the grounds that are referred to as weaponized Keynesianism. They claim that government spending doesn't create jobs, unless it is for the military. Many opponents of cuts in the military spending now argue against them, not in terms of national defense, but on the grounds that they would create job losses. In fact, economists tell us reductions in military spending will have a far less negative impact on jobs than comparable reductions in medical care or infrastructure. He continues saying that if America's extensive worldwide military engagements were proving effective at bringing stability to troubled countries, he says, I would feel conflicted in noting that these impose a terrible drain on our economy and interfere with what we need to do to resume economic growth. But however, he says, but in fact, such interventions rarely work. Heavily armed young Americans are an excellent fighting force, but a U.S. military presence is rarely the best way to resolve long-standing ethnic, religious, or other social tensions. President Eisenhower's farewell address. This is January of 1961. We're going to be looking at some clips from President Eisenhower's farewell address to the American people. The three clips are going to be when he warns of the permanent armament industry. The second is Pentagon's effect on the councils of government. That's where we hear military-industrial complex. Then he's going to talk about the university's subjugation to the military and the federal budget.
A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience.
So here's the military spending in context. What we have here is military spending beginning in this graph here about 1976. You can see the ramp up through the military expansion of the Reagan years, peaking in the mid-1980s. And then we see a slow decline, and then we see the peace dividend, in which it begins when the Soviet Union decided to basically disaggregate. And once we didn't have the Soviet Union to force us to spend more and more arms, we were able to spend less, and we call that the peace dividend. And you can see that the amount of military spending declined significantly during this time period that's labeled peace dividend. But then something happened, what's called 9/11. Once we had the events of 9/11, military spending began to increase very substantially, and there was a lot of off-the-books financing for the military, a lot of additional spending, and you can see that it almost doubled from around $400 billion up to over $800 billion in just a few years. That's a lot of money to be thrown into an organization, and there's a lot of profits to be made by those who would be there to fulfill every wish and need of the Pentagon. And there were many companies who made a lot of money during that particular time frame. There was just so much around. And then after the wars in Iraq wound down, Afghanistan, of course, is still ongoing. The military spending began to decline, and with the election of President Trump, the trajectory has now once again gone up, and now we're looking at $716 billion for the Defense Department. And there are other parts of the defense establishment that are funded in other areas. Veterans Affairs, for example, is another very significant piece. But this peace dividend in the mid-1990s was intolerable to many of the people in the military, and it appears that something funny happened on the way to 9/11. There was a lot of pressure to create new enemies, and we did. We now have a global war on terror that, as we heard earlier, is going to continue, and the sole purpose of war is that it just has to continue, according to George Orwell. The 2019 budget request shows that was originally $727 billion, 61% of the discretionary federal budget. Then we see the veterans benefit on the bottom left-hand side, and that is 7% of this total. And all the others, education, community housing, healthcare, transportation, is all getting squashed because the military is taking more and more of it. And the interesting thing is that the money is going to ever larger corporations who are accountable, and there's more direct subsidies in what could be referred to as crony capitalism. To make all this happen, the Department of Defense has a very significant public relations team. The DoD has to sell the American public on the value of foreign military interventions, because most Americans generally oppose them. They must spin bombings of hospitals and droning of innocent civilians at wedding parties as being in the best interest of America's defense. And they have to actively prevent and divert or neutralize claims of war crimes, none of which sounds very good to the American people, so you have to actively prevent that from getting there. If we take a look at the amount of advertising, this isn't doing anything productive, it's just telling you, the American people, that the military is great and that we haven't done anything wrong and that we just do great stuff. So the lower part of the bar chart shows that we're up to about $591 million just to tell us what a great job they're doing. And there's no money for this particular conference of any significance. We're trying to tell you a different story, but we don't have $591 million to promote our perspective.
The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
So an alert and active public. So who cares about the federal deficit anyways? The councils of government, of course, are what was referred to in the last video clip that we just saw. And the U.S. House and Senate voted to give the military a $716 billion budget for 2019. This approved one of the biggest defense budgets in modern American history, despite concerns from some economists and lawmakers about the rapidly rising federal deficit. But who cares? It's for a good cause. To put this in perspective, the 2019 budget increased the amount by $82 billion from the previous year. The votes for the Connecticut delegation were that Blumenthal and Murphy voted yes. Senate approved the budget 85-10. The House approved the budget 361-61, and all of the 5 congressional representatives voted for that. This is not a Republican versus Democrat. It's one great big let's celebrate the military-industrial complex party. The Republicans and Democrats voted 361 in favor, and you can see that actually more Democrats voted for this increase than Republicans. And if you take a look at the nays, the Republicans had more nays than the Democrats. It's not clear to me just what all their issues were. Maybe there wasn't enough money in there, but this has huge bipartisan support, especially in an election year, because this was voted on a few months before the election. So how much is $82 billion? The increase in this 2009 budget exceeds all tuition at public colleges and universities, which was estimated at $70 billion. This is a part of an initiative that Bernie Sanders had brought forth. So we ask a question: would the U.S. government, would the U.S. Congress increase the federal deficit by $70 billion per year to invest in students at public colleges and universities? We'll leave that one on the table and unanswered at the moment.
The technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded.
So let's take a look at the amount of science and technology S&T funding. This is a graph that goes back to 1978, and it shows the 3 different components of the S&T funding. The blue at the bottom is basic research, the middle is applied research, and the top is advanced technology development. Almost all of this is unusable in the civilian sector And the amounts that we're seeing here are 12 to 14 billion dollars. This is a very significant amount of money in which can control what the universities not only are looking at, but in order to kind of compete with other universities, they have to also make sure that people don't go off topic and start talking about things like cutting the military budget on campus. So because of that, this has a very insidious effect on the freedom of speech on university campuses and distorts the perspectives of the students. And $14 billion is a lot of money. $70 billion, as we saw earlier, is all the tuition money. This is about a quarter of that amount, thereabouts. And if you want tuition assistance, the state of Connecticut is glad to give you some in the if you can qualify for the post 9/11 GI Bill. You can get 100% of your in-state tuition paid for. You can get a monthly allowance of $1,700, and you can get $1,000 towards your books. This is kind of like a military Keynesianism approach, because you're going to prime the pump economically by getting students in, but you have to have gone through basic training, learn to kill, follow orders, and largely become indoctrinated into a certain way of thinking. Only then do you get these benefits. And let's take a look at the perspectives on the amount of science and engineering graduates that there are. This is a graph of the science, technology, engineering, and math programs. China is graduating 4.7 million students with these degrees. India's 2.6 million. The United States and Russia are roughly tied, and a significant amount of the graduate program in the United States are foreign students coming to the United States to pay full freight or large tuition support, and that's a significant piece of the number that you see there in the United States. And then we have Iran, Indonesia, and then Japan for the number of graduates in these programs. The next thing we're going to talk about is concentrating who gets the Pentagon money. So who benefits when you concentrate the profits? Large defense contractors. There's a countable number of the major players. Martin Marietta, General Dynamics, and a host of others that are large and receive vast sums from the government. Those companies have sophisticated approaches to lobbying. They have the ability to influence local public opinion because they're so large. So who benefits from infrastructure spending? Well, the people do. But to do this, we have innumerable small contractors. They have limited trade associations. They've got minimal capability to perform any lobbying on their behalf. And in the past, labor unions have become relatively neutered and are not very effective. A lot of their membership has eviscerated. It's gone away. And taking a look at Joe Courtney, 2nd Congressional District in Connecticut, we have this conversation going on where he is trying to encourage the U.S. Navy to abandon what it does now, which is farm out some of the submarine repairs to smaller shipyards so that there's more shipyards that are capable of working on these projects. And it's expensive, there's additional paperwork, and he's arguing that, well, we should streamline and that we should give Electric Boat the 300 jobs that it would take to do this kind of work. But what that tends to do is concentrate the money coming into the district into a well-known, organization who can then thank Joe in many different ways for his support. And so this is one of the things that happens when you concentrate the power. The power then becomes even more concentrated, and you end up with this huge case of crony capitalism, where the defense contractors rely on Congress, Congress relies on the defense contractors, and the American people are someplace in the equation, but it doesn't seem to matter very much. Labor unions could be effective, but strong labor unions are an alternative power structure that has been discouraged in my lifetime very effectively. They could be an effective bulwark against corporate power. They could be an effective voice for human needs. But these unions have been weakened by free trade agreements, the offshoring of jobs, reduced membership. There's been an erosion of union protections, and fewer resources are there to promote non-military uses of the budget or the budget deficit, the borrowed money, for investments in other non-military purposes. There's also an effect on foreign policy. Military Keynesianism and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. President Trump recently expressed reluctance to halt arms sales to Riyadh, citing economic concerns. He said, "Well, I think that would be hurting us. We have jobs. We have a lot of things happening in this country. We have a country that's doing probably better economically than it's ever done before." Trump then expressed reluctance to halt arms sales to Riyadh, citing these economic concerns. Part of that difficulty is what we're doing with our defense systems, and everyone is wanting them. Frankly, I think that would be a very, very tough pill to swallow for our country. I mean, you're affecting us. So, jobs over any form of morality. So let's talk about developing a Connecticut strategy. With military Keynesianism in mind, what strategies would be effective? Well, the New Haven resolution that we heard about earlier in the program has a strategy for calling and supporting human needs. The New Haven reality. On some days of the month, 22% of New Haven families, and in the poorer neighborhoods up to 70%, go hungry. Over 25,000 families, about 59%, are rent burden, which means they pay more than 30% of their income in rent or mortgage plus utilities. Over 10,000 families are on a wait list for subsidized housing. At the present rate of service, some will have to wait 25 years. In 2012, New Haven had a resolution. It was a presidential election year. There was a non-binding resolution on the New Haven ballot that said, "Shall Congress reduce military spending, transfer funds to convert to civilian production, create jobs to rebuild our infrastructure, meet pressing human needs?" The referendum received 27,550 votes and passed by nearly 6-1. In January 2017, following a public hearing, the New Haven Board of Alders passed a resolution calling for federal legislators to cut the military budget and use the savings to fund human services, infrastructure, and other local needs. A letter was sent to Congresswoman Rosa DeLore, Senators Richard Blumenthal and Chris Murphy, asking them to respond to the resolution. They never responded. And since 2017, Congress has added $110 billion to the military budget. All Connecticut's 5 House members and 2 senators have voted for that additional funding. There's actually an insidious way of doing this. I think it was the 2017 budget, I think for fiscal year 2018, where they voted against the budget in total, but they had voted for adding money for many of the programs in Connecticut that would get money to General Dynamics and the United Technology companies. And then they voted against the entire package and said, no, we didn't do that. We didn't vote for it. But they voted for the things that increased the budget, so knowing that the entire budget was going to pass and that they would get the accolades and then be able to have plausible deniability. In 2017, New Haven's Mayor Tony Harp introduced to the U.S. Conference of Mayors, which encompasses mayors from cities over 30,000, a similar resolution calling for public hearings on redirecting cities' monies to support cities' needs and not have the money go to the military. It passed unanimously. Charlottesville, Virginia, Montgomery County, Maryland, Evanston, Illinois, New London, Ithaca, New York, West Hollywood, California, Wilmington, Delaware have all passed similar resolutions. And we can do that in other towns here in Connecticut. There's a next resolution that's in the works. The New Haven Board of Alders is now considering a new resolution that would require our Congresswoman and 2 senators to testify on what they are doing to reduce the U.S. military budget and redirect funds to human needs. So for Connecticut Strategy, this resolution or these resolutions demonstrate an important way to educate the public, to create local pressures, and put the pressure on federal legislators for converting our military economy into a people's economy.